She had sworn never to call him again. But tonight, her lips cracked and bleeding, her back pressed against the freezing cold storage door, while the man behind her gasped with rage. Nadia Vale realized that vows sometimes only last until you truly need to survive. Her fingers trembled as she dialed the number. The phone rang once. "Can you come get me?" On the other end of the line, the room fell silent as Lucien Vero recognized the voice of the only woman he had ever let walk out of his life alive. Now she was begging him, and Lucien Vero never overlooked a debt of the heart. If you want to know how that night ended, and why it shook the entire city of Blackwater Harbor, stay until the end. Hit like and comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far my story has come. The rain came down like something personal. It hit the corrugated roof of the Harbor Line grill in waves, each gust off the water driving it sideways into the cracked windows. The kind of late October rain that found every gap in your coat and every doubt in your chest. The harbor smelled like diesel and low tide, and the kind of desperation that clings to industrial neighborhoods long after the industry has left. Blackwater Harbor was that kind of place. A city that had promised itself a future and slowly stopped believing it. Inside the grill's kitchen, the fluorescent tube above the prep station had been flickering for 6 weeks. Nobody had fixed it. The bulb strobed in irregular intervals, washing everything in a sickly white pulse that made the stainless steel look diseased. Nadia Vale stood at the deep sink with the tap running cold because the hot water heater was dead again, pressing a wet bar rag against her bottom lip. The blood came away pink and diluted. She checked her reflection in the dark of the window above the sink. The glass turned to a murky mirror by the blackness outside, and studied the damage with the detached, clinical focus of someone who had learned to evaluate injury the way other people evaluated weather. Swollen left cheekbone, split lip, not deep, wouldn't need stitches but would take 3 days to close. A bruise climbing toward her eye socket that would turn purple by morning and yellow by Friday. Cosmetically survivable, structurally fine. She'd had worse. That was the thought she hated most, that she was able to produce it so quickly, so automatically, and she shoved it back down with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing exactly that for the better part of her 23 years. Behind her, the kitchen was empty. The 2 line cooks, Marco and a heavy-set kid everyone called Denny, who'd worked here 4 months and never learned to make eye contact, had already cleared out the moment Marlo Griggs's voice climbed past a certain register. They'd done it before. They would do it again. Nadia didn't blame them. She understood it completely. When a man like Griggs started building to something, the smart play was to disappear from his radius. The problem was, she hadn't been able to. The problem was, she'd been in the walk-in freezer doing inventory when he came in from the back, and by the time she heard the particular quality of his footsteps, the flat, deliberate tread of a man who had already decided something, there was no clean exit available. She'd heard him go to the register first. Then she'd heard the silence that followed, which was the worst kind, the kind that preceded everything. He'd found her in this freezer holding a clipboard and a ballpoint pen that had mostly stopped working in the cold, and he'd come in and shut the door behind him. The temperature in there was 22 degrees. He was wearing his good shirt, the dark green one he put on when he had meetings with people who scared him, which meant he'd just come from somewhere that had put him in the worst possible version of himself. "Register's 40 short," he'd said. She'd told him it wasn't her. He'd told her he knew it was her. She'd asked how he knew. He'd answered by slamming her into the door housing with his forearm across her collarbone. Not a punch. Something more deliberate. The kind of force that says, I am in control of this, and I am choosing how much. She'd dropped the clipboard. The pen skittered across the freezer floor. "Don't tell me you don't know," he said, very close to her face, his breath visible in the cold air between them. His eyes were bloodshot. He'd been drinking since at least noon. She could smell the bourbon layered under the cigarette smoke. But he wasn't sloppy. He was the specific kind of drunk that stripped away whatever restraint he normally managed. She'd kept her voice flat, calm. She'd said, "Let go of me, Marlo." He'd answered by pulling her off the door and throwing her sideways into the metal shelf, and the clipboard she'd dropped caught her across the cheekbone on the way down, which was how she'd gotten the bruise. The lip she got trying to catch herself on the prep counter and missing. Then, mercifully, his phone had gone off. Some call he couldn't ignore. He'd looked at her on the floor, then at the phone, then back at her with an expression that held nothing she could read clearly except volume. a high, ugly register of rage compressed into something almost calm. "We're not done," he said. He walked out. She'd been standing at the sink for 4 minutes since then. The fluorescent light pulsed. The tap ran cold. Outside, the rain kept doing what it was doing. Nadia turned off the faucet and leaned both hands on the edge of the sink, staring at the window. Her reflection stared back. She looked at the woman in the glass and felt the familiar process beginning. The internal accounting, the tallying of options. She had $40 in her checking account. Her car had been dead in the lot behind her apartment building for 2 weeks, a busted alternator she hadn't been able to afford to fix. Her landlord had already left one message about the rent. She had no family to speak of. Her mother had been gone since she was 11, her father gone considerably before that, and the various variations on family that the foster care system had offered her had ranged from indifferent to significantly worse. She had, technically, a phone. She had, technically, one number she had kept across 3 new phones over 3 years without being entirely able to explain why. She'd told herself it was information. Insurance. The same reason you keep a fire extinguisher you hope never to use. She stared at her own face in the dark window and understood that she was about to use it. The decision was not sudden. It had the feeling of something that had been building for a long time. Since the first time Griggs shoved her, since the moment she'd realized this job was the best option currently available to her, since the cold, specific night 3 years ago when she'd packed a bag and left a life that was clean and warm and protected, and deeply, fundamentally wrong for her in ways she hadn't been able to stop thinking about since. She took out her phone. The number was in the contacts under a first name only. She stared at it for a moment. Then she pressed call. It rang once. A sound came from the other end. The particular quality of a room going silent around a person. Not the silence of an empty space, but the silence of multiple people suddenly holding very still. Nadia. His voice hadn't changed. That was the first thing that hit her. She'd half expected 3 years to have done something to it, some erosion, some softening. But it came through exactly as she remembered, low, measured, with that faint continental edge he'd picked up somewhere in a biography he'd never fully shared with her. A voice that had learned a long time ago not to carry its information in its tone. She didn't let herself hesitate. "Can you come get me?" A pause. 2 seconds. "Where are you?" "The Harborline Grill, Pier 9. "Are you hurt?" She looked at her reflection. "Cosmetically." Another pause, shorter. "Stay inside, don't go near the windows." The line went dead. Nadia lowered the phone and stood in the flickering kitchen and breathed. Her hands had stopped shaking, which surprised her. She'd expected them to keep shaking. Instead, they felt oddly still, the way hands get after they've made a decision they can't reverse. She didn't know whether that was relief or something she'd regret. She found out in 9 minutes. She didn't count them consciously. She didn't stand at the sink with her eyes on her watch, performing the vigil. She went through the motions of closing procedures instead, wiping down the prep station, checking the pilot lights on the range, because movement helped, and because the Harborline Grill was going to need to open again in the morning, regardless of what happened tonight. And she had, despite everything, never been the kind of person who left a kitchen dirty. She was rolling the mop back into the closet when she heard the cars. Not the car. The cars, plural. The particular sound of multiple engines cutting in sequence, the kind of coordinated arrival that wasn't accidental. She crossed to the pass-through window that looked out into the dining room, and what she saw made something tighten in her throat that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anything else she had a clean name for. 3 black SUVs were parked along the harbor curb, their engines off but their presence enormous, displacing the empty nighttime street the way large predators displace the animals around them. The rain came down over them and ran off their hoods in sheets, and they sat there like geological features, things that had always been there and would remain. The front door of the grill opened. Lucien Vero stepped inside. He was wearing a charcoal overcoat that was dark with rain across the shoulders, and he moved through the space between the door and the center of the dining room with the particular quality of motion that she had never been able to fully describe to herself, except as the absence of wasted movement. Not graceful, exactly. Not aggressive. Something more precise than either. He had the kind of physical presence that reorganized a room simply by entering it, not through size, because he wasn't enormous, but through the accumulated weight of being a man who had never, in any room he'd ever occupied, been unsure of where he stood in it. Behind him, two men entered and stopped just inside the door. They didn't move further. They didn't need to. Lucien's eyes found Nadia immediately. He crossed the room to her. He stopped 3 feet away and he looked at her face. The cheekbone, the lip, the careful way she was holding her jaw because the freezer had knocked something in her neck that was still making itself known. And he didn't say anything for what felt like a long time. His expression didn't change. That was what struck her. She'd expected something to move in it. Anger, concern, the particular texture of feeling that comes across in a person's face when they see someone they've cared about damaged. But his face held completely still. If anything was happening behind it, and she knew from experience that they were happening somewhere too deep to surface. He reached out and very slowly, very carefully, turned her chin slightly with 2 fingers so the kitchen light through the pass-through fell on the bruised side of her face. She let him. "Who?" he said. One word, flat as pavement. "Manager, Marlowe Griggs." She kept her voice even. "He thinks I stole from the register. I didn't." Lucien released her chin. He turned and looked at the dining room the way a person looks at a property they're considering purchasing. Evaluating the walls, the tables, the arrangement of things. His jaw had tightened once, briefly, when he'd seen the bruise. That was the only signal. "Is he here?" "He went out. I don't know when he's coming back." Lucien turned back to her. "Get your things." Lucien, "Your things, Nadia." Not sharp, not urgent, just finalized. The tone of someone for whom the present sentence was the closing of a matter and not the opening of a discussion. She got her things. It didn't take long. Her coat from the hook by the back door, her bag from the shelf above it, her keys, which were useless because the car was dead, but she took them anyway out of muscle memory. She came back through the kitchen and out into the dining room and found Lucien standing exactly where she'd left him, looking at his phone with the patience of a man who is managing something much larger and more complicated than this room. He looked up when she emerged. He nodded toward the door. Outside, the rain immediately soaked through the shoulders of her coat. One of the men by the SUVs opened the rear door of the middle vehicle without being asked, and Nadia climbed in because the alternative was standing in the rain, arguing with Lucien Vero in front of his people, which was something she had no energy for, and also a battle she would not win. Lucien got in beside her. The door closed. The cars moved. She sat in the leather seat with rain dripping from her hair and watched the harbor lights slide past outside and understood, in the very specific way of someone who has just done something irreversible, that she had introduced a significant complication into her life. The car was warm. The seats were real leather. There was a partition between them and the driver, and behind that partition, whoever was driving navigated the harbor district's industrial blocks with the kind of efficiency that came from knowing every route and every camera and every pattern of late-night traffic in this city. She and Lucien hadn't spoken since they got in the car. She broke it. "One night," she said. "That's all I need. Somewhere safe for one night, and then I'll figure something out." Lucien was looking out his window at the harbor. "All right. I mean it." "I heard you." She waited for more. He didn't provide it. She turned and looked at the side of his face, the sharp line of his jaw, the faint scar along his left cheekbone she'd never gotten a straight answer about, the dark eyes that processed things she could rarely read. He was 37 now. He looked like he'd spent 3 years doing exactly what she'd always feared he would, running the machine he'd built, maintaining it, fueling it with the quiet violence that kept its gears moving. "You haven't asked why I called," she said. "You needed help." He turned and met her eyes. "You called me." "That's it? That's the whole reaction?" Something moved in his face then, barely. The closest he came to what someone else might call softness. "What reaction did you want?" She didn't answer that. She didn't have one. The SUV climbed out of the harbor district and up the coastal road that curved north along the cliffs, and through the rain-fogged window, Nadia watched the lights of Blackwater Harbor spread out below. The industrial piers, the dormant cranes, the scatter of apartment buildings and bars that made up the lives of people who'd made a different set of choices than the ones that had led her here. The estate came into view as the road crested the last rise. She'd seen it before, years ago, and the memory of it hit her now with the uncomfortable clarity of something she'd spent 3 years not thinking about. It sat back from the cliff road behind a perimeter she'd never been able to see the edge of, all stone and glass and elevation, the kind of structure that said its occupant had once needed very badly to be unreachable and had made permanent architectural arrangements to that effect. Guards at the gate who were visibly armed. A driveway that curved away from the road behind mature trees. Cameras she could spot, and presumably a significant number she could not. She told herself the night she'd left this place that she would never come back. Here she was. The gate opened as they approached. Inside, the house was exactly as she remembered it, which was, to say nothing, like a home, and everything like a command structure that someone had furnished attractively. High ceilings, heavy floors, everything in grays and blacks, and the occasional severe dark wood. The art on the walls was real and expensive and cold. The kind of place designed to impress and inadvertently revealing, in that effort, exactly how little warmth had shaped its occupant. A woman named Sasha, who Nadia vaguely remembered as a kind of household manager, met them at the door and showed her to a room on the east wing without being asked, which meant Lucien had called ahead during the drive, which meant he'd made arrangements before she'd even finished telling him where she was. She stood in the room, cream walls, real furniture, a window overlooking the cliff garden, and set her bag down on the bed and sat beside it. One night, she'd said. She looked around the room, she'd said it, and she'd meant it, and yet. The thing was, she thought, staring at the window where the rain came down black against the glass, that she'd spent 3 years building a life that was measurably worse in every material sense than what she'd walked away from, and she'd spent that same 3 years telling herself that was okay, because she was free, because she was her own, because the safety that Lucien's world provided came attached to the thing inside his world that had made her leave it. The things she'd seen, the things she'd begun to understand were part of the architecture of how he operated. The knowledge that caring for him meant accepting the machinery around him, and the machinery was built from things that couldn't be undone and wouldn't be dismantled. She'd been right to leave. She knew that. She still knew that. And she was sitting on a bed in his house with a split lip and bruised face, which meant being right had gotten her exactly this far. She was almost asleep, the crash after adrenaline, the body collecting what it was owed, when she heard the knock. "Come in," she said, though she already knew who it was from the cadence of the knock. Lucien opened the door and remained in the frame. He'd taken off the overcoat. The sleeves of his dark shirt were rolled to his forearms, and he was holding something. She focused. A small black kit, the kind that held first aid supplies. "Let me look at it properly," he said. She wanted to tell him she was fine. She looked at him in the doorway, and what stopped her wasn't the bruise or the exhaustion or the complicated geography of what it meant to be here with him again. What stopped her was his hands. She'd noticed them 3 years ago, and she noticed them now. Lucien Vero had the hands of a man who had done irreversible things with them, who carried that knowledge in the way they rested, in the economy of how they moved. But when he crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed beside her and opened the kit and began to clean the cut on her lip with the careful, methodical attention of someone for whom this particular task required all his focus, they were the steadiest hands she'd ever seen. She sat still and let him work. He pressed a butterfly closure across the worst of the split. He examined the swelling on her cheekbone with 2 fingers. He said nothing. "How bad?" she asked. "Not bad." He capped the antiseptic. "You'll be sore for a week." "I've been sorer." He didn't say anything to that. He returned the items to the kit in the same order he'd taken them out. "Marlowe Griggs," he said, closing the kit. "Tell me what you know about him." She started to say it was nothing. A restaurant owner, a loan shark operating behind a business front, exactly the kind of man that a harbor district accumulated, the way drains accumulated everything else the water washed in. But something made her pause, because there was something else. Something she'd almost not thought twice about because she hadn't had a frame for it at the time. A week ago, she'd come in early to prep for a private dinner Griggs was hosting. Not uncommon, he rented the grill out twice a month to various people she was never introduced to. But she'd come in early enough that the previous meeting hadn't quite cleared out. She'd heard voices from the back office. She'd seen, through the narrow gap of the not-quite-shut door, Griggs leaning over a table across from 2 men she didn't recognize, and on the table between them, a shipping manifest. Not a restaurant invoice, a harbor shipping manifest. And the men Griggs was speaking to were wearing union lanyards, but they weren't dock workers. She knew dock workers, had grown up adjacent to that world, knew what a man's hands looked like after years of that labor. These men's hands were clean, and one of them had said something she'd half heard and mostly dismissed. A number. A time. And then the word containers. She told Lucian this. He listened with absolute stillness. When she finished, the silence lasted long enough that she heard the rain on the windows and the distant sound of the harbor far below the cliff. "Who else did you tell?" he said. "Nobody. It was nothing. I thought it was nothing." Lucien stood. He moved to the window and looked out at the black rain and the black water far below, and in the way his shoulders set, in the particular quality of how he went still, Nadia recognized something she had seen in him before, the specific stillness of a man processing something that changed the shape of a situation he thought he understood. "What?" she said. He turned. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't decode, something that ran underneath his usual composure, something that might have been worry if she'd seen it on someone else's face. "Sleep," he said. "I'll have someone outside your door." "Lucien, sleep, Nadia." He left. She stared at the closed door. Outside, the rain didn't let up. Below the cliff, the harbor moved its cargo and kept its secrets. Somewhere in this house, Lucien was on the phone with someone, and whatever he'd learned or suspected from those few details she'd handed him without knowing their weight was already in motion, already becoming the kind of problem that didn't resolve quietly. She understood, lying back against the clean, cold pillow, with the butterfly closure on her lip and the bruise doing its slow work across her cheekbone, that the one night she'd asked for had already become something else. What she didn't understand yet, what she wouldn't understand until morning, when Lucian's security chief came to her door with a photograph and a question that made her blood go cold, was that Marlowe Griggs hadn't come after her because he thought she stole $40 from a restaurant register. He'd come after her because someone far more dangerous than Griggs had told him to, and that someone now knew exactly where she was. She didn't sleep. She tried. She lay on top of the covers with her coat folded across the chair and her shoes still on, because sleeping in a strange place with her shoes off felt like a concession she wasn't prepared to make. And she stared at the ceiling while the rain moved through its cycles outside and the house around her produced its sounds. The distant, muffled quality of men talking in rooms she couldn't see. Footsteps in the corridor that paused briefly outside her door and then continued. The low frequency of machinery she couldn't identify that ran somewhere beneath the floor. Lucian's house at night was not quiet. It was controlled. There was a difference. At some point, the rain thinned to something more like mist, and she must have gone under briefly because when she opened her eyes, the window had gone from black to the gray-blue of very early morning, and her neck was stiff from the angle she'd fallen into against the headboard. She sat up. The butterfly closure on her lip had held. The cheekbone had stiffened overnight into a dull, persistent throb. She pressed 2 fingers against it experimentally, assessed the damage, removed her fingers. Her bag was on the bed beside her. She pulled it open and found a travel toothbrush from a gas station purchase 3 weeks ago, and a hair tie and $11 in cash that she'd forgotten was there. $11. She sat with that for a moment. Then she got up, went to the attached bathroom, and spent 4 minutes making herself look like someone who had chosen to be here, rather than someone who had arrived bleeding in the back of another person's car. It was a limited project. She did what she could. When she came back into the room, the knock came almost immediately, as though whoever was outside had heard her moving. She opened the door. The man in the corridor wasn't Lucien. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, compact and broad across the shoulders in a way that read functional rather than decorative, wearing a plain dark shirt untucked over slacks. His face was the kind that had been rearranged at some point and healed slightly off from its original arrangement. He had a tablet computer in one hand and a mug of coffee in the other. Ms. Vale. Not unfriendly. Not warm, either. Professionally neutral. "Mr. Vero would like you to come down when you're ready. I'm Castle." "What does he want?" "He'd like to show you something." A brief pause. "He asked me to bring you this." He held out the mug. She took it because she needed it, not because she was inclined toward accepting hospitality, and she followed Castle down the corridor and the wide stairs and through 2 rooms to a space at the back of the house that faced the cliff garden. A room that functioned as something between a study and a situation room, with a long table along one wall covered in what appeared to be maps and printed documents, and a monitor mounted above it showing a harbor surveillance feed. Lucien was standing at the table. He'd clearly been there all night. He had the specific quality of wakefulness that came from stimulants and will rather than rest. Still dressed, collar open now, the sharp focus in his eyes carrying a rim of something raw underneath. There was a second mug on the table, empty, and an ashtray with 2 cigarette ends in it. He'd quit smoking 2 years before she left, she remembered. She noticed the ashtray and said nothing. He looked up when she came in. "Come here," he said. She crossed to the table. He stepped aside and let her see the photograph lying on top of the documents. It was a still pulled from surveillance footage, grainy, timestamp in the corner reading 4 days ago, 11:47 p.m. The location was clearly a section of the harbor shipping yard, the stacked containers visible in the background along with the cranes and the water beyond. In the foreground, partially obscured by the angle, 2 figures standing beside a black sedan. One was a man she didn't recognize, heavy-set, wearing a dock union jacket. The other was Marlowe Griggs. "That's him," she said. "Griggs, look at the car." She looked. The sedan's rear door was open. Inside, not immediately obvious because of the camera angle and the dark, was a third figure. A woman, sitting very still, her posture suggesting restraint rather than choice. Nadia's stomach dropped. "The vehicle is registered to a shell company," Lucien said. He was watching her face rather than the photograph. "The shell company routes back through 2 holding entities to a logistics firm that manages 6 cargo operations out of this harbor. The man with Griggs is a dock official named Terrence Priel. He processes cargo clearances." "And the woman in the car?" Lucien paused, just briefly. "She was reported missing 11 days ago. Her name is Cora Des, 21. She worked as a bartender at a restaurant 3 miles from the harbor line." Nadia set down the coffee mug because her hand didn't feel fully reliable. "Is she—" "We don't know." Lucien picked up a second photograph and laid it beside the first. This one showed a cargo container, its number clearly visible, sitting in a staging area at the edge of the shipping yard. This container cleared customs processing 4 days ago. Officially, it's carrying textile manufacturing components heading to a port facility in another state. He let that sit there. Nadia looked at both photographs, then at him. "You knew about this before last night. I knew something was moving through this harbor that shouldn't be," he said. "I didn't know the architecture of it. I didn't have Griggs's name or the connection to Priel." His eyes stayed on hers. "What you saw in that back office, those men with Griggs, that was part of the pipeline. You walked into the middle of it. And Griggs knew I saw. Griggs told someone you saw. That's different and worse." She heard what was in the space under those words. "Someone told him to deal with me. Someone told him you were a problem." She turned away from the table. She walked to the window that looked out onto the cliff garden, where the pre-dawn mist sat between the low stones and the salt-stripped shrubs, and she pressed one hand flat against the cold glass and made herself breathe normally. Behind her, Lucien didn't say anything. He understood, and this was one of the things about him that had always unnerved her, the way he understood when silence was the correct response without needing to work it out. "Who is the someone?" she said. "That's what I'm working on." She turned. "Your people have been working on this all night." "Yes." "And?" He picked up a third document from the table, printed, multiple pages, clipped together. He held it out to her. She crossed back and took it. The top page was a financial summary. Multiple columns, account numbers, transfer records. She was not a forensic accountant, and much of the detail meant little to her, but she could read a name, and the name at the top of the document, the name attached to the account that served as the terminus point for a series of transactions that moved through the various shell entities Lucien's people had traced overnight, was a name she knew. Not personally, but in the way everyone in Blackwater Harbor knew it. The way you knew the names of certain buildings. Councilman Everett Raines. She looked up from the document. Lucien was watching her with his arms crossed, his expression containing something that might have been regret if it had been anyone else. "The anti-crime councilman," she said. "Yes. The one who's been running on a platform of cleaning up the harbor district." "The same." She lowered the document. She thought about Raines's face. She'd seen it on campaign posters for 2 years. The professionally concerned face of a man promising accountability, promising to push back against exactly the kind of criminal infrastructure that apparently funded his operations. She thought about the speeches she'd half heard on news broadcasts in the background of the grill during evening shifts. How deep, she said. Deep enough that moving against him without airtight evidence creates more problems than it solves. Lucien uncrossed his arms and put both hands on the edge of the table. And deep enough that he has significant interest in making sure you don't get the opportunity to tell anyone what you heard. I heard 30 seconds of a conversation through a door. I don't even know what it meant. He doesn't know what you know. He only knows that you were there. The room felt smaller than it had 60 seconds ago. Nadia set the document down and pressed her fingers against her forehead and thought through it. The geometry of it. The specific way the trap had closed around her without her having done anything except show up to an early shift. Your advisors, she said. What are they telling you? He didn't answer immediately. She read the pause correctly. They're telling you to stay out of it. They've expressed that perspective, he said. And what are you telling them? He picked up his cigarette pack from beside the ashtray, looked at it, set it back down without taking one. An old habit interrupted by a newer one. I'm telling them I'm still thinking. Lucien. She waited until he met her eyes. This isn't your fight. Something moved across his face, fast and then gone. You called me. I called you because Griggs hit me and I needed one night somewhere safe, not because I needed you to go to war with a city councilman. Those two things are not currently separable. They could be. I could leave the city. I could... Where would you go? Not a question. The flat recitation of a reality. With $11 and a dead car and no family and a man with political cover and criminal infrastructure who has decided you're a liability. She felt the heat climb her face. Don't. Don't what? Don't list my situation at me like you're making a case. I know my situation. Then you know you have limited options. I know I have limited options, she said, and her voice came out harder than she meant it, with an edge she hadn't loaded consciously. I also know that every time I've taken the option you were offering, I ended up in a place I needed to escape from. The room went very quiet. Outside, somewhere on the cliff, a bird was doing something in the mist. Lucien held her gaze for a long moment without flinching, which was the thing about him she'd always found most difficult. That he absorbed direct hits without deflecting, without going defensive. He just received them and stood there with them. That's fair, he said. I'm not trying to be fair. I know. He picked up the empty mug from the table and moved past her toward the door. Breakfast is in the kitchen. Sasha will show you. Don't leave the property. He stopped in the doorway without turning around. Please. The please landed differently than she expected. She didn't say anything. He left. She stood in the room with the photographs and the documents and the surveillance feed showing the gray harbor in early morning, and she stayed like that for a while, thinking about the word please in Lucien Vero's mouth and what it cost a man like him to put it there. Castle found her in the kitchen 40 minutes later. She was on her second coffee and had eaten most of a piece of toast without tasting it, sitting at the long kitchen island and staring at the countertop. He came in with the tablet and sat down across from her without being invited, which told her something about how the morning was going. We got a name, he said. He turned the tablet to face her. On the screen was a surveillance still. Different camera, different location, recent timestamp. The man in the image was standing outside what appeared to be a government building, mid-50s, thick across the middle, with the practiced public-facing posture of someone who spent significant time being photographed. Not Raines, someone else, someone adjacent. Deputy Director of Harbor Operations, Castle said. Name's Leonard Swick. He sits on the oversight committee that processes cargo clearances at this harbor. He's the one who made the call to Griggs. She looked at the image. He called Griggs directly? Burner phone, but the cell tower data puts the call inside this building at the time Griggs made contact with his people. Castle took the tablet back. He's the operational link. Raines is the money and the protection. Swick is the day-to-day. How do you people know all this? Castle looked at her with an expression that suggested he found the question unnecessary. She pressed. How does Lucien have this much reach into Ms. Vale? Castle set the tablet down on the counter. Mr. Vero has been in this city for 20 years. He has reach into things because he spent 20 years building it. That's the answer. She understood that. She did. The trouble was that understanding it and being comfortable with what it meant were separate exercises. She was about to respond when she heard footsteps, and then Lucien was in the kitchen doorway, still wearing the same shirt from last night, and behind him was a man she hadn't seen before. Younger, late 20s, moving with the compressed energy of someone who'd just arrived from somewhere and hadn't downshifted yet. "This is Reyes," Lucien said. He was looking at Nadia. "He was at the harbor this morning." Reyes, the younger man, glanced at Nadia with the evaluating, impersonal look of someone assessing a variable rather than a person, then turned back to Lucien. "Priel's been moved. Somebody cleared him out of his apartment last night. Cleanly, his stuff's still there. Looks like a voluntary departure, but fast." "Timeline," Lucien said. "Call records put his last contact at 2 a.m. He was gone before 4. "Who warned him?" Reyes shook his head. "Unknown. But the clearance on Container 7 Foxtrot 12 was processed at 1:30 a.m. It's already staged for the 6 a.m. loading window." The name of the container landed in the room like a stone in still water. Nadia looked at Cassel. He was already looking at Lucien. "That's the container in the photograph," she said. Nobody corrected her. Lucien turned and looked at the window above the sink, at the cliff garden and the water beyond, and the particular quality of his stillness in that moment was different from the other stillnesses she'd observed in him in the past 12 hours. This one had direction, like pressure building behind a door. "We have," Reyes checked his watch, "4 hours before that loading window." "Then we have 4 hours," Lucien said. Cassel stood up from the counter. "The advisors are going to—" "I know what the advisors are going to say." Lucien turned from the window. His eyes moved to Nadia briefly, just briefly, a contact check, something assessing, and then back to Cassel. "Set it up. Use the Meridian Street location, not here." Cassel and Reyes exchanged something with their eyes, and then Cassel picked up the tablet, and both men left the kitchen. Nadia sat with her coffee going cold in front of her. "You're moving against the container," she said. "We're going to find out what's in it." He crossed to the coffee maker and poured the last of the carafe into a mug. His movements were efficient and entirely controlled, and they revealed nothing. "And if it's what I think it is, we're going to make sure it doesn't move. And if it gets traced back to you?" He drank the coffee. "It won't be traced back to me." "That's not an answer. It's the only answer that matters right now." He set the mug down. "Nadia, the woman in that photograph, Cora Des, if that container moves on the 6 a.m. window—" "I know," she said. "Then you know why this is happening." She did know. That was the problem. Knowing why didn't make her more comfortable with what it required. She looked at her hands flat on the countertop. She thought about Cora Des, 21, worked as a bartender. She thought about the shapes of the other women who weren't in photographs because no one had taken photographs. She thought about the dock at midnight and cargo manifests and dock officials with clean hands. She thought about what kind of person could know about all of that and choose the option that kept their hands clean. "What do you need from me?" she said. Lucien set his mug in the sink. "Nothing. You stay here. I'm the only one who can identify Griggs by sight. Your people have photographs. I have. You stay here. Flat. Complete. Lucien, this is not a discussion I'm having with you." He turned and looked at her with something that briefly stripped the composure from his face. Not anger exactly, something more urgent and less controlled. "You called me from that kitchen with blood on your face. You are not going near that harbor." The moment stretched. She nodded. Not agreement, exactly. Acknowledgement. He left the kitchen. She sat and listened to the house reorganize itself around his instructions. The movement of people, the opening and closing of rooms, the low exchange of voices preparing for something. The cliff garden went from mist to pale morning light outside the window. The harbor below reflected the early sky in long silver strips between the dock structures. She stayed where she was, until Sasha came into the kitchen at 8:45 with a look on her face that said something had come through, and she handed Nadia a phone without explaining and said, "It's for you," in a tone that made Nadia's hand move before her brain had finished processing the sentence. She put the phone to her ear. Nothing for a moment. Then a voice she recognized with a cold, immediate certainty. A voice she'd last heard saying, "We're not done," at her while she was still getting up off a freezer floor. "Hi, sweetheart," said Marlo Griggs. "Bet you thought last night fixed things." Her grip tightened on the phone. She kept her voice from doing anything she'd regret. "How did you get this number?" "Same way I get most things. Someone who owed me a favor." A wet, satisfied sound. He was eating something, casual, performing ease. "I just want you to understand the situation. I don't have anything against you personally. You were in the wrong place, you heard the wrong thing, and now some people are paying attention to you that you really don't want paying attention to you." "I don't know what you heard." "Everybody says that." He chewed something. "Here's the thing, though. Whether you know something or you don't, it doesn't actually matter anymore. What matters is that a person I work for has decided you're a problem, and that person has a very particular way of resolving problems." A pause. "Shacking up with Lucien Vero doesn't change that math. If anything, it makes the math more complicated for everybody." "What do you want?" "I want you to come talk to me, alone. No Vero people, no security, just you. We can make this very simple." Another pause. "Or it stays complicated, and complicated in this situation means things happen to people. You understand what I'm saying?" She understood exactly what he was saying. She understood that it was a lie, that there was no version of "come talk to me alone" that ended with her walking away, and that whoever had coached Griggs on this call had also coached him poorly because the threat was too naked and the offer too obviously a mechanism. But she also understood something else. She understood that Griggs had called her on a phone inside Lucien's house, which meant someone inside had provided the number, which meant the perimeter she'd assumed was the reason she was safe was not the perimeter she'd thought it was. "I'll call you back," she said. She hung up. She sat with the phone on the counter in front of her and the morning light coming in over the cliff garden and the sound of Lucien's people moving through the house on the other side of the walls. And she sat with the cold, specific knowledge that someone in this building had just told Marlo Griggs exactly where she was. She picked up the phone again. She went to the call log and found the number Griggs had called from, and she looked at it for a long moment. She needed to tell Lucien. The problem was that telling Lucien meant telling him in a house that had just proven it had a leak, in front of people she couldn't evaluate, while he was already in motion on a separate operation that was going to take everything it had. She thought about Castle's eyes when he told her not to leave the property. She thought about Reyes arriving with the news about the container. She thought about the 12 hours since she'd made that call from the Harborline kitchen, and the way everything had accelerated since, and whether that acceleration had entirely been the result of Lucien's response, or whether some of it had been the response of someone watching Lucien respond. She set the phone down. She stood up. She walked through the kitchen to the door that led to the side corridor, and she moved through the corridor to the study where the documents and the surveillance feeds were. And she stood in the doorway and looked at what was laid out on the table with fresh eyes, with the eyes of someone who now had a specific question to bring to the material. The container, the loading window, the timestamp on Priel's last contact. She walked to the table. The documents were there as Lucien had left them. She sorted through them with careful, quiet hands, not knowing exactly what she was looking for until she found it. A printed email chain, 3 pages, the kind of thing that gets printed and added to a pile and isn't looked at carefully because the operative details are elsewhere. She read the chain from the bottom. The first email in the chain was an internal communication from Harbor Operations. Standard administrative language, nothing alarming. But it was dated 3 weeks ago, and the routing listed in the header showed it had been forwarded to an address she didn't recognize. She checked the address against the names she'd accumulated in the past 12 hours. It didn't match Griggs. It didn't match Priel. It didn't match Swick or Rains or any of the entities they'd been tracking. But it had an account name. And the account name, partially obscured, ended in the letters she needed to see. She picked up the paper. She read the partial address 3 times. Then she heard the footstep in the corridor behind her, and she turned and found Cassell standing in the doorway, watching her with an expression that had changed considerably since their conversation in the kitchen. He was no longer wearing the tablet. His hands were at his sides, very still. "You should put that down," he said. She didn't put it down. That was the first decision. Small, immediate, made in the space between one heartbeat and the next. and it committed everything that followed. She held the printed email chain against her chest with both hands and looked at Cassell across 12 feet of room and understood with the specific clarity that adrenaline produces that she had approximately 3 seconds before the situation resolved itself in a direction she couldn't control. "Put the paper down, Ms. Vale." His voice had changed register completely. The professionally neutral quality was gone. What replaced it was something older and more precise. "You don't want to make this harder." "Where's Lucien?" she said. "He's occupied." Castle took one step into the room. His hands stayed at his sides, but his weight had shifted forward slightly, the posture of a man measuring distance. "That's why you need to put the paper down and come with me before this gets complicated." "It's already complicated." She kept her voice even. She was calculating the room, the table between them, the door behind Castle, the window to her left that looked onto the cliff garden. The window was her worst option. The door was his. The table was the only negotiating position she had, and she was already at it. The email address, the forwarding address at the bottom of the chain. "That's you." Silence. A muscle moved in his jaw. "How long?" she said. He looked at her for a long moment with something working behind his eyes that she couldn't fully read. Not guilt exactly, something more complicated. The expression of a man for whom this moment had been a calculation for some time and had now arrived ahead of schedule. "That doesn't matter to you," he said. "The hell it doesn't. What matters to you right now is that you put the paper down and we have a conversation about what comes next without what? Without me telling Lucien that his head of security has been routing internal communications to Councilman Raines for..." She looked at the date on the chain. "At least 3 weeks?" She watched his face. "Longer than 3 weeks." Nadia. The first time he'd used her name without the formal prefix. Something shifting in the register of the conversation. Some pretense being set down. Lucien is already moving on the harbor operation. That can't be stopped. What can still be managed is the outcome. For you, for me, for several people who don't deserve to be in the radius of what happens when Lucien Vero finds out something like this. "So you want me to manage it for you? I want you to be practical. You put me in danger." The heat came into her voice before she could stop it. "Whatever you told Raines, whatever you passed along about who Lucie's people were looking at, about the container, you told them I was here. You're why Griggs called this house." Castle didn't deny it. That was what made her hands tighten on the paper. Not the betrayal, which was its own enormous thing, but the absence of denial. The flat, pragmatic acknowledgement that, yes, this was the shape of it, and the shape of it now required management. "How many people?" she said. He didn't follow. "How many containers? How many times has Raines moved something through this harbor on a clearance that went through this house first?" She watched his face harden. "You've been in this organization for how long? You knew what to watch for. Every time Lucian's people got close to something connected to Raines, you..." "Stop. You buried it." "Stop talking." His voice had gone flat and deliberate in a way that was more frightening than if he'd raised it. He took another step forward, and this time she moved. She went sideways along the table, keeping it between them, her hip catching the corner. The pain that fired up from the bruise was useful. It sharpened everything. "If I walk out of this room with this paper," she said, "and you stop me, he'll know. The second he can't find you and can't find me at the same time, he'll know something happened in here. You know him well enough to know that." Castle stopped. He knew it was true. She watched him know it. The brief recalculation visible in the set of his mouth, the way his eyes moved to the door and back. "So neither of us is walking out of this room for a minute," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. Her pulse was doing something complicated in her throat, and she was very aware of the distance to the door and the weight of the paper in her hands and the specific measurable danger of the man across the table. "So talk to me. How long?" A long moment. Cassell walked to the window and looked out at the cliff garden with his hands clasped behind his back. And in the morning light, she could see what she hadn't seen in the kitchen, that he was tired in a way that had been accumulating for a long time, the kind of tired that predated last night by years. 8 years, he said. She heard the number and felt it land with physical weight. "I was already working for Raines when Lucien recruited me." His voice had gone flat and factual, stripped of performance. I was younger. It was a different set of circumstances, and by the time I understood what Rains was actually doing, the kind of operation he was running, I was already in it deep enough that the option to step away had closed. And you stayed. And I stayed. He turned from the window. His eyes were clear and exhausted and entirely without plea. I've spent 8 years walking a line between two men and keeping both of them from each other's throats, and what I've managed to do in that time, what I've managed to prevent Rains from doing to this organization, you have no frame of reference for. I have a frame of reference for Cora Des, Nadia said. The name hit him. She saw it. I didn't know about the trafficking. He said it quickly. The first quick thing he'd said. That's not... I was passing operational intelligence. Routes, timelines, which of Lucien's people were looking at which targets. I was not... You kept Lucien away from Rains for 8 years, she said. Every time Lucien's organization got close to understanding what Rains was doing, you misdirected them. That's not a passive role. I kept this organization from a war it would have lost, and the women in this containers. The silence that followed was the most honest thing he'd said. She picked up the email chain and folded it with hands that were not entirely steady and put it inside her shirt against her sternum, held in place by the waistband of her jeans, and she moved toward the door. Cassell didn't stop her. He stood at the window with his hands at his sides and the morning light on his rearranged face, and he looked like a man who had just watched the last version of his calculation fail. Nadia. His voice stopped her in the doorway. She turned. He's going to the harbor with 7 people, Cassell said. The operation he's running this morning, Rains knows about it. Rains has known since last night. A pause. Because I told him. The hallway behind her was empty and the house was full of its busy, purposeful sounds, and she stood in the doorway and processed what Cassell had just handed her, and understood that the situation had just changed its shape entirely. When did they leave? She said. 20 minutes ago. She ran. What? She found Sasha in the kitchen, and she said Lucien's number, and Sasha looked at her face and dialed without asking questions, which was perhaps the most useful thing anyone had done for her in the last 14 hours. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She dialed again. 4 rings. Voicemail. She thought about what Castle had said. 7 people. Rains knows. She thought about what it meant for a man running a trafficking operation with political cover and criminal infrastructure to know in advance that his main threat was arriving at the harbor with 7 people and a 4-hour window. She dialed Reyes. He picked up on the second ring. Where are you? She said. Who is... It's Nadia Vale. Where are you? A pause. The sound of wind and machinery in the background. Harbor sounds. We're staged at the perimeter of Yard 7. Why are you... Listen to me. Castle has been working for Rains for 8 years. He told Rains about this morning's operation last night. You are walking into something that's been set up in advance. The silence that followed lasted 2 full seconds, which, in the context of what she'd just said, was an enormous amount of time. Say that again, Reyes said. Castle is Rains' source inside this organization. He tipped Rains. Whatever you're walking into at that harbor, they know you're coming and they've had 12 hours to prepare. She pressed the phone harder against her ear. Where's Lucien? He's at the container staging area. He went in 20 minutes ago with 3 of our people. Another pause, shorter. You're sure? I have the email chain in my shirt. I'm sure. She heard Reyes move, the sound of rapid footsteps, a door, the harbor sounds changing quality as he went from interior to exterior. She heard him say something away from the phone in a low voice, urgent, and she heard the word extraction, and then his voice came back. I'm going to him. Stay where you are. That's not... But the line was already different. Not dead, but transformed. She could hear him moving, and the sounds of the harbor, and then a sound she wasn't immediately able to identify. And then she was able to identify it, which was the particular flat crack of a gunshot far away. And then another. And then the line did go dead. She stood in the kitchen with the phone against her ear, and the deadline and the morning light, and the cold coffee on the counter, and for a moment she was completely still. Not calm, nothing like calm, but the specific paralysis of someone whose body has just received too much information simultaneously and is working to process it in order. Then she was moving. She went through the kitchen to the corridor to the front of the house, and she found the third-floor room she'd identified on her walk from the bedroom, the one with the high east-facing window that looked over the cliff road down to the harbor. And she stood at the glass and looked. From this height, on a clear morning with the harbor mist burning off, she could see the shipping yard. She could see the stacked containers and the cranes and the water. She could see, with the distance working against the detail, several vehicles staged along what she calculated was the approach road to Yard 7. She could also see, at a distance that compressed everything to shapes and movement, smoke. It was coming from somewhere near the container staging area. Not enormous, not a building fire, not an explosion, but the dark particular plume of a vehicle burning. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and counted the vehicles she could see and tried to identify shapes and movement among them, and could not, because the distance was too great, and because her hands were shaking properly now for the first time since last night, the adrenaline finally finding the crack. Her phone, still Sasha's, she'd never given it back, buzzed in her hand. Unknown number. She answered. "Ms. Vale?" The voice was one she'd never heard before, but she knew its type immediately. The polished, carefully modulated tone of a man who spent his life in rooms where he was never the least powerful person present. "My name is Everett Rains." Everything in her went cold and tight. "I understand we've been having some communication difficulties this morning," Rains said. "I want to resolve that because I think we both want this situation to end cleanly." She said nothing. "Mr. Vero is currently in a complicated position at the harbor," Rains continued, with the tone of a man describing a traffic situation. "His people encountered some resistance at the staging area. Nothing fatal at this point, but the situation is fluid. Whether it stays non-fatal depends somewhat on the decisions made in the next hour." "What do you want?" "The same thing I've wanted from the beginning. This doesn't need to be your problem. You're a waitress who heard part of a conversation through a door. That's all you are, from my perspective, if you make a particular choice right now." "What choice?" "Leave. Just leave. Take a car from the estate, I'm sure there are several available, and drive out of Blackwater Harbor and don't come back. Don't go to police. Don't contact journalists. Don't produce whatever documentation you found in whatever room you've been searching. Just leave." A pause. "And Lucien Vero walks away from that harbor this morning, out with his people. And this ends." She looked at the smoke on the horizon. She thought about what she knew about men who made offers like this one. She thought about Cora Des. She thought about the shipping manifest and the loading window and the container that was staged somewhere in the yard where the smoke was coming from, and she thought about what was in the container and what happened to it if she walked away. "The woman," she said, "Cora Des, and whoever else is in that yard." A pause, fractionally longer than the others. "That's outside the scope of what we're discussing." "Then we're not discussing anything." The pause this time lasted 4 full seconds. She counted. "Ms. Vale." The Polish had thinned slightly, something underneath it, briefly visible. "You're making a very serious error. I need Lucien's location, and I need your people to stand down at that yard. You're not in a position to—" "I have your financial records," she said. 8 years of routing, the transfers through the shell companies, the logistics firm. I have an email chain that puts your communications inside this organization. I have enough to walk into any federal office in this state and spend the next 6 hours talking." She kept her voice level. "Or you stand down, and Lucien and I have a conversation about what comes next, and what comes next doesn't necessarily have to involve the federal government." She was lying about most of it. The email chain was real. The rest she was building from what she'd seen on the table and extrapolating with the specific creative confidence of someone who has absolutely nothing left to lose. Rains went quiet. She could hear him breathing. "You have no idea," he said finally, very quietly, "what you are doing. Stand down," she said, "and tell me where he is." The line went quiet for so long she thought he'd disconnected. Then, "Warehouse B, south end of Yard 7. A pause so thin it was almost not there. "You should know that even if I tell my people to stand down, there are elements at that harbor this morning that are not my people." The line went dead. She was already moving before the phone left her ear. She took the keys from the rack by the side door. a set of plain black keys for one of the estate's secondary vehicles, a dark SUV parked on the north side of the property that Sasha pointed to without asking why when Nadia held up the keys. She drove badly and fast down the cliff road, her hands at 10 and 2 and her jaw tight, the email chain pressing against her sternum through her shirt like a second heartbeat. The harbor approach was a series of industrial blocks, warehouses, equipment storage, the long, flat structures of the dock support facilities. And it was approximately 6:30 in the morning and the streets were not empty, but not full, the specific occupancy of an active shipping harbor in early morning. She went through 2 intersections too fast, and the SUV's traction control spoke to her on the wet road, and she eased back, made herself breathe, because arriving wrecked was worse than arriving late. She found Yard 7 by following the access road that ran along the chain-link perimeter, and by following the smoke, which was coming from the south end. And when she turned the corner on the service road that ran between Warehouse B and the water, she had to brake hard because there was a vehicle blocking the road. Not a crash, but deliberately positioned, a dark panel van angled across the lane with its lights off. She stopped the SUV. She got out. The air tasted like salt and char, and something chemical beneath both. The smoke was coming from a burning sedan she could see 40 yards further along, fully involved, its windows gone. The sounds were wrong. She couldn't hear voices, couldn't hear movement, just the fire and the harbor water, and somewhere the low movement of machinery. She moved along the warehouse wall with her shoulder close to the corrugated metal, which was cold and wet with the residual mist. The light was still thin, the harbor not yet at full morning. Her shoes were wrong for this. Waitress shoes, the flat non-slip type, which were quiet at least, which was something. She reached the corner of the warehouse and looked around it. There were 4 men in the open ground between Warehouse B and the next structure. 3 of them were on the ground. She catalogued them with rapid, clinical efficiency. 2 appeared to be Lucien's, 1 unknown, all 3 apparently alive because of the specific quality of how they were positioned, conscious but not moving freely. Zip ties. She saw the zip ties from here. The 4th man was standing. He wasn't Raines's. She understood that immediately. Raines's people would have had the polished quality of operators, the private security aesthetic. This man was something else. Older. Weathered differently. The kind of man who came out of a particular background that left specific marks on the way they stood and held their hands. He had a phone to his ear. He hadn't seen her. She looked past him toward the warehouse door. It was open. The large rolling door partially raised, and inside the dark of the warehouse she could see Lucien. He was standing approximately 20 feet inside the warehouse near a second vehicle, and he was not zip-tied, which meant something had gone differently than the 3 men outside, which meant he'd gotten inside before the perimeter closed. He was talking to someone she couldn't see at this distance, and his posture was the coiled, extremely controlled posture of a man surrounded by people he couldn't kill yet. And then the angle shifted slightly as she moved and she saw the someone he was talking to. Marlowe Griggs. Griggs was inside the warehouse with 2 additional men, and he was holding something at hip level with the specific relaxed confidence of a man who'd been holding it long enough that it felt natural. He was talking. She couldn't hear the words from here. She could see Lucien's face. She'd seen Lucien's face in many configurations over the years she'd known him. She'd seen him angry in ways that barely registered on his surface. She'd seen him coldly furious. She'd seen him do things she hadn't been able to watch and remain composed herself. She had a fairly comprehensive internal catalog of Lucien Vero's emotional register and its external signatures. She had not seen this. He looked at Griggs the way a man looks at something he intends to take apart, very slowly and very carefully. And underneath that, underneath the absolute predatory control, she could see the thing she wasn't supposed to be able to see. The thing he was managing with everything he had, the thing that was making his jaw tight and his hands very still. He was scared, not for himself. She knew what he was scared for, and the knowledge of it hit her somewhere behind the sternum with a force she wasn't prepared for. She pulled back around the corner. She stood against the warehouse wall with the metal cold at her back and the email chain pressing against her chest and the sound of the standing man's voice. He'd started talking into his phone, low and brief. And she ran through the geometry of the situation the way she'd been running through geometries her entire life, when the options were all bad and the cost of getting it wrong was permanent. The The standing man was between her and the warehouse door. Lucien was inside with Griggs and two others. 3 of Lucien's people were down in the yard. Reyes was somewhere. She didn't know where. She had no weapon. She had a phone that wasn't hers and a piece of paper, and the particular problem of being a person who had been in exactly this kind of situation before. Not a harbor yard, but the specific situation of being the least powerful person in a dangerous room and having to find the one thing available to her that the powerful people hadn't thought to control. She thought about what Rains had said. Elements that are not my people. She looked at the standing man again. He had finished the call. He was looking at his watch. She thought about the container. She thought about the loading window. 6 a.m. And it was past 6 a.m. now, which meant the window was either closing or had been extended for operational reasons. She looked toward the far end of the yard and found what she was looking for. The container. 7 Foxtrot 12. Sitting exactly where it had been in the surveillance photograph, staged at the yard's water edge on a flatbed. Still here. She looked at the container, and she looked at the standing man, and she looked at the open warehouse door where Lucien was being held at gunpoint, and she assembled the only plan available to her from the materials on hand, which was a bad plan, an incomplete plan, a plan that required things to go right in a sequence that had very little margin. But it was a plan. She stepped out from the corner. "Hey," she said. The standing man turned. She held up the folded email chain. "I have Rains's financial records," she said, loud enough to carry across the yard. "The transfer routing, 8 years of it. And I just got off the phone with him, so he knows I have it. Which means if anything happens to me or to anyone in that warehouse, this goes straight to the federal wire and he has no play left." She watched the man's eyes, which had gone from startled to evaluating with remarkable speed. "Call him. Ask him." The man looked at her. She held the paper steady and kept her face neutral and waited, with the knowledge that she was standing in the open in a harbor yard with 3 unconscious men behind her and the wrong people between her and the only person she had left in this city. And she was running the gamble on Rains's self-preservation, on the idea that a politician running an 8-year operation would be more afraid of exposure than he was committed to the clean resolution of one loose thread in a warehouse. The man pulled out his phone. He dialed. He listened. His expression changed. And then, from inside the warehouse, she heard Lucien's voice, the specific register of it when it was addressing a room, the absolute controlled authority of it. And she heard Griggs's voice answering it, higher and less controlled. And then she heard a sound she couldn't immediately classify. And then she heard silence, and then she heard Reyes, from somewhere above her, from the warehouse roof, shouting something in the clipped staccato of a man running a tactical instruction. And the standing man in the yard looked up toward the roof and then back at Nadia, and the phone was still at his ear, and whatever Rains was saying through it was making his face do something complicated. He lowered his weapon hand. Not dropped. Lowered. Nadia walked toward the warehouse door. Her legs were doing what she needed them to do. Her hands were not shaking. She thought, one step, and then the next step, and then the next one. She reached the rolling door and stepped over the threshold into the warehouse dark, and the first thing she saw was Griggs on the ground. Not badly hurt, not dead, but definitively down. And Lucien standing above him with the specific quality of a man who had just resolved a calculation and was now moving to the next one. He looked up. He saw her. The look on his face lasted approximately 1.5 seconds before his composure closed over it. But she saw it. The relief. And underneath the relief, something older and more complicated. Something that had survived 3 years and a split lip and a burning car and a harbor full of people trying to end both of them. He crossed to her in 4 steps. He put one hand on her jaw, carefully, the way he'd cleaned her wound last night, with the same focused precision, and turned her face to check it, the same clinical inspection, and she stood still for it and let him. "I told you to stay at the house," he said. "Castle has been working for Rains for 8 years, she said. "He tipped them about this morning. That's why you walked into this." The hand on her jaw went very still. She watched the information move through him. "He told me before I left," she said. "Cassell. He told me you'd already gone." Lucien's hand dropped from her face. He turned and looked at the warehouse, at Griggs on the ground, at his 2 people who were moving now, recovering, at the open door in the yard beyond where the standing man was still on the phone with Rains, and she watched him assemble the new shape of everything, the corrected map, the 8-year version of events with Cassell's presence written into it retroactively, all the missed moments and buried leads and decisions that had made sense until now. His face didn't do the thing she'd feared. It didn't break. It didn't flood. It went somewhere harder and quieter than she'd ever seen it go, somewhere that was past anger and past betrayal into a cold, specific region that frightened her more than either. He turned back to her. "The container," he said, "still in the yard." "Reyes." He said it toward the ceiling, loud enough to carry, and from somewhere above them Reyes answered. Lucien said, "The container, now. Take whoever's standing." Then he looked at Nadia. "We need to leave," he said. "The people in the—" "Reyes has it." He moved toward the door and she followed, because the alternative was standing in a warehouse in a harbor yard, and that was not somewhere she wanted to be for any longer than necessary. Outside, the standing man had lowered his phone. His partner, she hadn't seen the second one, had been too focused, was standing at the far end of the yard with his hands visible. Lucien walked past both of them without stopping. She followed him to the SUV she'd driven in. He looked at it briefly, then at her. "You drove here," he said. "You weren't answering your phone." He walked to the passenger side without further comment, which she chose to interpret as acceptance, and she got into the driver's seat and started the engine. In the rearview mirror, she could see Reyes and 2 other men moving toward the container at the yard's water edge. She drove. They were 2 blocks from the yard when Lucien's phone rang. He looked at it, then answered. She drove and kept her eyes forward and listened to the one side she could hear. Short responses, affirmatives, the particular clipped quality of receiving significant information. And when he ended the call, he sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. "Reyes got the container open," he said. She gripped the wheel, and— a pause, not long. 7 people inside, all alive. She breathed out. "Corrades is one of them," he said. She drove 2 more blocks before she had to pull over. She put the SUV against the curb, and she sat with both hands on the wheel and breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the specific rhythm of managing something that was trying very hard to come out in a way she couldn't afford right now. Lucien sat beside her. He didn't say anything. He didn't touch her. He just sat there, present, while she worked through it, and the specific quality of his not speaking was one of the most decent things she'd ever received from another person. When she had it under control, she sat up straight. "Cassell," she said. "He'll be at the estate." "You're not going back there?" "No," Lucien agreed. "What do we do?" He looked out the windshield at the harbor district waking up around them. The delivery trucks, the early workers, the ordinary business of a city that didn't know what had just happened 3 blocks away in a shipping yard. "Rains will move to contain this," he said. "What happened at the yard, Bam?" "The container, the people inside it, that goes wide in the next few hours. He can't stop that. He can try to manage it. But the container is open and there are witnesses and Reyes has documentation." He turned and looked at her. "What he can still control is the financial record, the documentation that ties him directly." She pulled the email chain from inside her shirt. She held it out. Lucien looked at it. He looked at her. "That's what I have," she said. "It's not everything." "It's enough to make him afraid," he said. "A man who is afraid makes mistakes." He took the paper from her. "We need to be in the room when he makes one." She looked at him. He looked back. The harbor moved around them, and the smoke from the yard was a thin line against the morning sky, and somewhere in the city, in an office building with his name on campaign posters in the lobby, Everett Rains was making calls and calculating losses and deciding how much he was willing to spend to keep the walls standing. "There's one more thing," Lucien said. His voice had changed again. Back into the register that she'd learned years ago meant something personal was about to surface past the machinery. "Cassell told me," he said. "Before I left the estate this morning, he came to me." She turned. "He told me about Rains, about the 8 years. Lucien's jaw was tight. "He told me because—" He stopped. He started again. "He told me because you found the email chain and he knew it was over, and because there was still something left in him that—" He stopped again. She waited. "He told me you were already on the phone trying to warn me," Lucien said. "He told me that so I'd know, if something went wrong in that yard, that you'd tried." The morning moved around them. She thought about Castle at the window with his rearranged face and his 8 years of a line walked between two men, and the specific tired quality of his voice when he said, "I told him." "Where is he now?" she said. "He walked out of the estate before I left." Lucienne looked at the windshield. "I don't know where he went." She looked at the email chain in Lucienne's hands. She thought about all the decisions that had led to this curb, this car, this particular morning. She thought about what a person was left with after 8 years of that kind of compromise. She thought about the 7 people in the container. She thought about what it cost and what it was worth, and whether those two things could ever balance. "Rains is going to move tonight," she said. "Whatever he's planning, it'll be tonight, before the container story reaches the press." "Yes." "So we have until tonight?" "Yes." She looked at him. "Then we need to move first." Lucian turned and held her gaze for a long moment, with something in his face she'd been trying to read for the past 14 hours, and was finally beginning to understand. It wasn't strategy, it wasn't calculation, it was something quieter and more permanent. The specific look of a man who has just understood that the person beside him is not a problem to be managed or a liability to be protected, but something else entirely. Something that had walked back into the fire when it didn't have to. He reached over and started the engine. "Drive," he said. She drove. Behind them, the harbor burned in the morning light, and ahead of them, the city waited with all of its corruption and all of its fear. And Councilman Everett Rains sat at the center of it, counting hours and making calls, and had no idea that the 2 most dangerous people in Blackwater Harbor were already on their way to him. Not as a mafia boss protecting an asset, not as a damaged woman with nowhere else to go, but as 2 people who had already lost everything were the most dangerous kind. Nadia understood that now. Understood it the way you understand things that become true in your body before your mind catches up. As she drove the SUV through the waking streets of Blackwater Harbor, with Lucienne beside her and the email chain on the seat between them and the clock on the dashboard reading 7:14 a.m. The city was doing its morning things around them. Delivery trucks, coffee shop shutters coming up, a man walking a dog along the harbor promenade who looked up at the dark SUV and looked away again. Ordinary life, proceeding in its ordinary grooves, indifferent to the specific catastrophe assembling itself in its margins. Lucienne was on the phone. He'd been on the phone in various configurations since they left the yard. Short calls, each one different in register. One that was clearly financial, something about accounts and freezing access. One that was operational, Reyes updating him on the container and the 7 people now in the custody of a doctor Lucienne apparently had on permanent retainer. One that was something else, something she couldn't categorize from the clipped monosyllables, but that left his jaw tighter when it ended than when it started. He put the phone down. "Rains is at his campaign office," he said. "He went there directly from wherever he was this morning. He's had 4 calls to his political attorney in the last 90 minutes, and 2 calls to a number we're running now." "The attorney calls are containment," she said. "He's building a story." "Yes." "What story can he build?" "The container was opened. 7 people. He can build distance. He can build a story in which he was investigating the trafficking operation, in which Griggs and Swick were operating independently, in which he's a victim of criminal infiltration of his political network." Lucian looked at the passing street. "It's not a good story, but it's a story that takes time to disprove, and in that time evidence gets managed and witnesses get scared, and we don't give him the time." "No," he agreed, "we don't." She turned onto the boulevard that ran parallel to the harbor's commercial district and caught a red light and sat behind a delivery truck while the light did its slow work. In the rearview mirror, the harbor was a strip of silver behind the industrial roofline. Somewhere in it, Reyes was managing the aftermath of the yard. "The masquerade fundraiser," Lucian said. She glanced at him. "Rains has a charity event tonight, the Oraline Opera House. It's been on his schedule for 6 weeks. Black tie, major donors, city officials." He looked at the road ahead. "He won't cancel. Canceling creates a story. He'll go because going says he has nothing to hide, because it puts him in a room full of powerful people who are invested in his survival, and because it gives him the opportunity to spend 4 hours managing his network in person. You want to go to it?" "I want to finish it there." The light changed. She drove. "We walk into a room full of his people," she said. We walk into a room full of people who don't want their names on what he's done. That's different. He picked up the email chain from the seat. This, combined with what Reyes documented at the yard, combined with the testimony of 7 people who were in that container, that's not something a political attorney can manage quietly. That's federal. That's national press. He turned the papers in his hands. Raines knows that, which means every person in that room tonight who has taken his money or covered for his operation is going to be calculating their own exposure very carefully. You're going to walk in there and make the calculation obvious. I'm going to walk in there and give them a choice. He set the papers back down. The ones who choose correctly become witnesses. The ones who don't. He stopped. Become something else, she finished. He looked at her. Yes, she thought about the opera house. She'd seen it from the outside a dozen times. The old stone building on the eastern harbor bluff. The kind of civic monument that cities built when they still believed in their own permanence. Crystal chandeliers visible through the tall windows on gala nights. The kind of room that felt impervious to the world outside it. She thought about walking into it. He'll have security, she said. So will I. People will get hurt. People have already been hurt. His voice didn't rise, but the weight in it shifted. 7 people in a cargo container, Nadia, Cora Des, and 6 others. And those are the ones we found today. She gripped the wheel. I know, she said. Then you know why tonight. She knew. She drove. And somewhere behind them, Blackwater Harbor went about its morning, unaware that its most celebrated public servant was spending it making calls that were trying to put the walls back up around a crime that had just walked out of a shipping container and into the light. They spent the day at a location she didn't know, a building in the commercial district's 2nd tier, the kind of address that looked like an insurance office from the street and was something else entirely on the floors above. Lucien's people had it prepared, a secure room, a table, communications equipment, and 3 people she didn't recognize who moved with the coordinated efficiency of a team that had rehearsed this specific kind of day before. Reyes arrived at 10 with documentation, photographs, the manifest, statements he'd taken from 2 of the 7 people who were currently stable enough to give them. He laid everything on the table, and Lucien went through it with the systematic attention of a man constructing something precise and load-bearing, and Nadia sat at the end of the table and read every page that came to her and added the email chain to the architecture of evidence in the specific place where it fit. She had done a version of this before. Not this, not anything like this exact circumstance, but the basic activity of taking scattered pieces of a bad situation and finding the load-bearing points. Foster care taught you that. You learned early to read the structures around you and find where the weight actually sat, because the official version of how things worked was almost never the true version, and surviving depended on understanding the difference. By noon, they had something. Not enough for a courtroom. Lucien said this flat and clear, not wishfully, just as a factual assessment. Not yet enough for a courtroom, but enough for a room full of people who were already frightened and looking for the exit. At 2 in the afternoon, Reyes received a call. He stepped away from the table to take it. When he came back, his face had done something she couldn't read cleanly. Cassell, he said. Lucien looked up from the documents. He reached out through an intermediary. Reyes set his phone on the table. He says he has records. Not the email chain, different, older. He says he maintained his own documentation for the past 8 years as, his word, insurance. Silence. Nadia looked at Lucien. His face held completely still for approximately 4 seconds, which was an enormous amount of stillness. He wants to give it to us, Reyes said, in exchange for... He paused. Nothing. He said no conditions. Lucien pushed back from the table. He stood up and walked to the window that looked out over the commercial street below, and he stood there with his hands loose at his sides, and she watched the particular quality of what was happening in his back and shoulders, the specific muscular language of a man managing something that was trying to surface in a way he hadn't permitted anything to surface in a very long time. Where is he? Lucien said. He's offering to come here. A long pause. Tell him to come, Lucien said. He didn't turn from the window. Cassell arrived 40 minutes later. He looked like a man who had not slept and did not expect to. He came in without a coat despite the October cold. and he set a flash drive on the table in front of Lucien without preamble, and he stood there with his rearranged face and his 8 years visible in the set of his shoulders, and said, "Everything I kept. Account numbers, transaction records, communications. It corroborates the chain and goes back further." Lucien stood across the table from him. He looked at the flash drive. Then he looked at Castle. Nadia sat very still. "The women," Lucien said. His voice was quiet in a way that was worse than if it had been loud. "The trafficking operation, how much did you know?" Cassell held his gaze. "I knew there was a logistics operation I was told not to look at. I didn't know what it was moving until—" He stopped. "Until approximately 8 months ago." 8 months? Yes. And after 8 months, Castle didn't look away. "I started keeping the records you're holding, because I knew when it came apart it would come apart fast, and I needed—" He stopped again. "I needed something to offer." The room was very quiet. Lucien picked up the flash drive. He held it for a moment. Then he set it in front of Nadia and looked at Cassell and said, "Get out." Cassell left without another word. Nadia looked at the flash drive, then at Lucien. His face had the color and texture of something that had been under sustained pressure for a long time. "Are you—" she started. "We have 4 hours before the gala," he said. She let it go. They spent the afternoon building what they were going to walk into the opera house with that evening, and she spent part of it on a call with a journalist, a name Reyes provided, someone who covered harbor politics, someone who had been trying to find the edges of Raines's operation for 2 years and had kept running into walls. She didn't give her everything. She gave her enough, a thread pulled from the right place, and made an arrangement about timing that would put the story in motion at a specific hour, regardless of what happened inside the Oraline. She set the phone down. She looked at her hands. They were steady. She thought, when did that happen? When did she stop shaking? She thought about the kitchen sink at the Harborline Grill, and the woman in the dark window, and the $40 and the dead car. And she thought about who that woman had been 24 hours ago, and she didn't recognize the distance cleanly. They entered the opera house at 9:15. Reyes had procured, she didn't ask how, appropriate attire. She was wearing a dark dress she'd put on in a bathroom 2 blocks from the Oraline, and it fit well enough, and she'd done what she could with her face, which meant the cheekbone bruise was visible but could pass in theatrical lighting as shadow. The butterfly closure on her lip was less visible against the color she'd put over it. Lucien was in a dark suit that fit the way his suits always had, as though it had been designed around the specific geometry of his discomfort with rooms like this one. He wore it with the ease of a man who had spent enough years in enemy territory to stop being visibly uncomfortable in it. They went in separately. That was the plan. She went in first, with an invitation that had been acquired in the same unasked-about way as the dress, and she stood in the lobby of the Oraline and let the room settle around her. It was everything she'd expected, and somehow more. The chandeliers working hard against the darkness of the harbor night outside. The dressed crowd doing the particular performance of people who had gathered to be seen performing charity, while the city's real transactions moved in the corners and the coat rooms. She scanned the room with the focused efficiency she had developed over years of reading restaurant dining rooms. Who was positioned where, who was talking to whom, where the sightlines ran, where the exits were. She found Raines in 4 seconds. He was across the room near the tall windows, holding a glass, talking to 2 men in suits with the easy authority of a man who had decided to perform normalcy all the way to the end. He was heavier in person than on the campaign posters. The public face was in full operation, the smile, the attentive lean toward whoever was speaking, the practiced body language of a man who had spent decades making other people feel specifically regarded. She looked at him and thought, "You called a woman from inside a man's house and offered her a deal, and she said no, and you're still here doing this, and you think it's going to hold." She moved into the room. She found a position near the bar with a sightline to the main entrance and a clear view of Raines's cluster, and she accepted a glass of something she didn't drink, and she waited. Lucien came in at 9:22. She clocked the moment Raines' security detail spotted him. A subtle reorganization, a man with an earpiece moving 2 degrees in a new direction, a brief murmured exchange. She clocked Raines himself receiving the information via a slight shift in the attention of the man beside him. A whispered word, Raines's hand tightening fractionally on his glass. He turned. He found Lucien across the room. The look between them lasted less than 2 seconds and contained everything. Lucien moved through the room the way he moved through every room, as though he had decided long ago where he was going, and the intervening space was simply a thing to cross. The crowd adjusted around him without being asked to. She watched people clock him and make the micro-calculation and find somewhere else to be in his trajectory. Because whatever Lucien Vero was projecting tonight, it was not something the Oraline's donor class wanted to be adjacent to without a plan. She moved. She crossed the room from the other direction, angling through the crowd from the east while Lucien came from the west, and the geometry of it converged on Raines's position with the precision of something rehearsed, which it hadn't been. They'd talked about tonight in terms of what they were carrying and what they intended, but the specific choreography was improvised, and she understood that it was working precisely because it was. Because the spontaneous convergence of two people moving with clear intention looked different from a planned approach, and gave Raines less time to calculate. She reached him 3 seconds before Lucien. Raines turned at her approach, and recognition crossed his face. The particular recognition of a man seeing the variable he'd underestimated. And his mouth opened, and she spoke first. "Hello, Councilman." Steady, clear, not loud enough to carry past the immediate radius. "I thought we should finish the conversation we started this morning." Lucien arrived at her left shoulder. Raines looked at both of them. The two suited men flanking him had moved closer, but Lucien's eyes went to them once, and something in that look stopped them where they were. Not a threat, not a gesture, just a look. The look of a man who had made a very specific calculation about what happened next, and was entirely at peace with it. "This is not the venue," Raines said. His voice was controlled. His hand was tight on the glass. "It's the venue we have," Lucien said. "I have 200 people in this room who are going to read about Councilman Everett Raines and Container 7 Foxtrot 12 in tomorrow's press, regardless of what happens in the next 10 minutes, Nadia said. She watched his face. "The story's already filed. I arranged that this afternoon. The question is whether you're in it as the architect or as someone who cooperated when given the opportunity." Raines looked at her. The practiced warmth of the public face had gone somewhere, and what was underneath it was harder and older and more honest. "You have no idea," he said quietly, "how many people you are threatening right now." "I know exactly how many," she said. 7. They were in a container in Yard 7 this morning. Corrades is one of them. She held his gaze. "The rest of your network can make their own decisions, but you're out. Tonight. That's the only offer." The room moved around them, the gala proceeding in its oblivious way, crystal glasses and polished shoes, and the string quartet doing something in the far corner. Nadia stood in the middle of it with the document architecture assembled over the past 12 hours, and the bruise on her cheekbone and the butterfly closure on her lip, and she looked at Everett Raines, and she did not blink. He looked at his glass. He looked at the room. She saw him calculate. Then he said very quietly, "You should know that I'm not the one you need to be afraid of tonight." Lucien spoke before she could. "Meaning what?" "Meaning," Raines started. The lights went out. Not a circuit failure. She knew that immediately from the quality of it, the simultaneity, every light in the Oraline going dark at once, chandeliers and wall sconces, and the subtle lighting above the bar. Everything plunging the room into the dark, with 200 people in it, and one secondary emergency light over the fire exit casting a thin red stripe across the far wall. The sound from the crowd, the collective intake of breath, the beginning of voices asking questions, lasted approximately 2 seconds. Then the gunshot, a single shot, high and to the right, coming from the mezzanine level, and Nadia's body moved before her mind had finished processing the sound. Sideways, hard, taking herself out of the standing position between Lucien and Raines, her hip connecting with the edge of a table as the crowd erupted into its own panic. Voices becoming screams, the sound of glass breaking, 200 people in formal wear moving in the dark toward exits they couldn't clearly see. She hit the floor behind the table. Her palms on the wood floor, the dress wrong for this, her knees absorbing the impact badly. She pressed herself against the table's base and tried to locate in the chaos above her the specific information she needed. Lucien, where was Lucien, and where had the shot come from, and whether it had found anything? Lucien! She set it into the dark at a level that could carry 3 feet but not 20. A hand found her shoulder. "Here." His voice right beside her, and she breathed out. "Rains." Gone. He was already moving. She felt him shift beside her, assessing the room. "Get up. Stay behind me." She got up. The emergency lighting was giving just enough to navigate by. The red stripe from the fire exit and the thin ambient glow from the harbor-facing windows. The city lights outside providing a gray baseline. Around them, the room was still moving, the crowd thinning as people found exits. The sound of heels on the marble floor and voices calling names, and somewhere the beginning of sirens outside. She stayed behind Lucien's left shoulder, close enough that his arm brushed her chest when he moved, and they moved through the thinning crowd toward the mezzanine staircase because the shot had come from above, and because the alternative was being in the open floor with the shooter at elevation, and that was worse. The staircase was at the room's north end. They reached it as the last of the civilian crowd pushed past them in the opposite direction. Nadia grabbed the banister and went up behind Lucien, her hand dragging along the rail, the carpet runner on the stairs making her footfalls nearly silent. At the mezzanine landing, the light from the harbor windows was marginally better. She saw him, not immediately. The figure was pressed into the corner of the mezzanine where the railing met the wall, and it took her 2 seconds of scanning before the shape resolved. A man, not large, jacket dark enough to blend, and in his right hand something she recognized the silhouette of without needing better light. Lucien stopped. She stopped behind him. The man looked up. "Vero," the figure said. The voice was flat and professional and entirely without the performance of threat. This was a man who had been hired to do something specific and was in the process of doing it. "Who sent you?" Lucien said. "You know who." "Rains. Rains is a politician." The man shifted his weight slightly. His hand with the weapon was loose at his side, not raised, which meant he was either making a calculation or he'd already made one. "Politicians don't hire people like me directly. There's a layer." A pause. "The layer is a man named Swick, deputy director. He decided that tonight was the night to close accounts." Nadia's breath moved shallowly. She counted the angles, the mezzanine landing, the railing to their left, the wall behind the figure, the stairs they'd come up at their backs, the weapon at the man's side. "Swick gave you both of us," Lucien said. "He gave me the situation. I assessed the targets." The man looked at Nadia, then back at Lucien. "I'll tell you what I told the last person who hired me for something I decided I didn't want to finish. I'm going to walk out of here. The police are 3 minutes out. You can tell them whatever serves you." He held up his free hand, empty, palm out. "Or we can have a different conversation." Lucien looked at the man. She looked at Lucien. The sirens outside had gotten closer. The mezzanine was quiet, the room below still moving with its residual chaos, but the acute danger of the crowd rushed past. 3 minutes. She could hear the specific quality of the silence the man with the weapon was offering, and she could hear the thing it would cost to accept it, and she understood that Lucien was running the same calculation. "Swick," Lucien said. "Third floor office. Staff corridor, north side." The man paused. "He stayed in the building." Lucien nodded once. The man walked to the far mezzanine exit, unhurried, and opened the door and was gone. Nadia let out the breath she'd been holding. Her knees were going to hurt tomorrow, both of them, from the floor and the stairs. Her lip had opened again. She tasted blood, the butterfly closure giving way somewhere in the scramble. She pressed 2 fingers against it. "Staff corridor," she said. "North side." Lucien was already moving. She followed. The staff corridor was accessed through a door marked private behind the bar service station on the mezzanine level, and it was a different world from the gala. Bare concrete and institutional lighting that was apparently on a separate circuit from the main hall, still functioning, fluorescent and stark. The sounds of the opera house were muffled back here, the sirens outside more audible. They moved through it quickly. The 3rd floor was up a service staircase that smelled of cleaning product and old building. At the top, another corridor, this one with offices, small doors, each with a nameplate or a number. They moved along it, and at the 4th door she heard it. Movement. Paper. The sound of someone moving fast through physical material, the specific sound of a person sorting documents and deciding what to take. Lucien stopped at the door. She positioned herself against the wall to his right. He opened it. Leonard Swick was behind the desk of what was clearly a borrowed office. Campaign materials visible on the shelving, nothing personal, a temporary workspace for a major donor using house facilities. He was holding a leather portfolio, and there was an open briefcase on the desk beside him, with papers half loaded into it. He looked up when the door opened. He looked at Lucien. He looked at Nadia. He looked at the portfolio in his hands. He set it down on the desk slowly. "Where's Rains?" Lucien said. Swick's mouth worked. He was a man built for corridors and conference rooms, the indoor political operator, the infrastructure man. And this room with Lucien Vero in the doorway was specifically not the environment he functioned in. "Rains went out the back," Swick said. 20 minutes ago, before the lights." "You knew about the lights." A pause. "Yes." "You planned it." "Rains planned it." Swick's voice was climbing into the register of a man who was discovering that the shape of culpability was not where he had located it. "I arrange logistics. That's what I do. I arrange things." "You arranged the shooter." "I arranged... That was not my..." He stopped. He looked at the portfolio. "I want to make a deal." "You want to make a deal?" Lucien said. "I have materials, financial records, communications between Rains and the trafficking network going back 5 years. I kept copies of everything, every instruction he gave me, every... Where is he going?" Nadia said. Swick looked at her with the evaluating look of a man recalibrating who, in the room, was the more immediate problem. "The harbor," he said. "He has a boat. Emergency protocol. He set it up 3 months ago when the investigation pressure started building. A berth at the private marina off Pier 16. He looked at his watch. If he's already gone, he left 20 minutes ago, which means... He's still there," Lucien said. "He was already turning. The police will be in this building in 2 minutes. Stay in this room and surrender to the first officer through the door." "You can't just..." "The portfolio goes to the officer with you." Lucien looked at Swick one last time with the flat assessment of a man who has finished with a room. "Everything in it. Don't edit it." He stepped back into the corridor. She went after him. They took the service staircase at speed, 4 flights of concrete in the dark, her hand on the rail, and her shoes wrong for this, and Lucien half a flight ahead of her, and the sound of the first responders entering the building below them like a clock running. She hit the ground floor service exit behind him, and the cold hit her immediately. October harbor air, the specific cold of the water at night. And they were in the service alley behind the Line, with the police vehicles visible at the building's front, light bars painting the stone facade in rotating red and blue. They went the other way. The private marina at Pier 16 was 6 blocks along the harbor walk. She knew this from the geography of the city she'd spent 3 years working in, knew the pier the way she knew all the piers, from a distance, from the perspective of someone who had always occupied the service side of the places that held people like Rains. They moved through the harborside streets at a pace that was not a run, because running drew everything, and a fast walk drew nothing. And she kept her hand against her lip to manage the bleeding, and kept Lucien's pace and didn't speak. 2 blocks from the marina, she heard it. A boat engine. Not running, turning over. The particular sound of a marine engine starting for the first time, cycling through its warm-up. They moved faster. The marina at Pier 16 was small. Private berths, expensive boats, the kind of facility that operated on a membership basis and had a staff security gate that was currently unmanned, the attendant presumably having responded to the sirens at the Opera House 6 blocks away. They went through the open gate and onto the dock, and the engine sound was immediately closer and directionally clear. The far end of the floating dock, 3rd berth, a cabin cruiser with its running lights off. Nadia saw Rains before Lucien did. He was on the boat's stern, casting off the last line, still in his gala attire. The tuxedo wrong for the dock in the same way she was wrong for the dock and the dress and the open lip. And he saw them coming at the same moment she saw him, and the expression on his face moved through 3 distinct states in approximately 1 second. Recognition, calculation, and something that for just a moment looked like the specific fear of a man who has finally run all the way to the edge. Then it closed back over. He stepped back toward the cockpit. "Rains," Lucien said. The engine was running. The lines were off. The boat was free. Rains looked at them from the stern of the moving vessel. The current already taking it, the gap between the hull and the dock beginning to open. "You have nothing," Rains said. the political voice still operational even now. You have the word of criminals and people who will say whatever they need to say to manage their own exposure. I have Swick, Lucian said, in a room with his portfolio, and I have a journalist with a filed story and a container that was opened this morning with 7 people in it. He stopped at the edge of the dock. The gap was 3 feet and growing. And I have her. He didn't gesture toward Nadia. He didn't have to. Rains looked at her. She looked back. She was bleeding from the lip, and her knees were bruised, and she was cold, and she was standing on a dock, in a dress that wasn't hers, in a city that had been trying to erase her for 3 days. And she looked at Everett Rains on the stern of his escape boat, and she thought about Cora Des, and she thought about the 7 people in the container, and she thought about the women who hadn't been in a container because they'd already been moved, and she thought about the word nothing that Rains had just used. I was a witness, she said. That's all I ever was. A waitress who heard part of a conversation through a door. She held his gaze across the widening water. And you tried to erase me. You sent Griggs to silence me. You tried to use me as leverage against Lucian. You put a shooter in a room with 200 people. The gap between the dock and the boat was 5 feet. All of that, for a waitress who heard part of a conversation through a door. She reached into the front of her dress. She held up the folded email chain. This is what that got you, she said. I hope it was worth it. Rain stared at her. The boat engine idled, holding position against the current's pull. He was 3 feet from the cockpit. He could leave. The boat was running and the lines were off, and he could walk into that cockpit and push the throttle and be moving in 10 seconds. And the harbor was dark and wide and... Mr. Rains! The voice came from behind Nadia. She turned. 2 men in dark jackets were coming down the dock at a controlled walk. Not police. The jackets said federal law enforcement. And she understood from the pace and the quality of their approach that they had not just arrived. They had been here. Waiting. She looked at Lucien. His face said nothing. His eyes said something. The 2 agents moved past her and stopped at the dock's edge. Mr. Rains, the first one said again, addressing the man on the boat across the gap of water. Special Agent Torres, Federal Organized Crime. I'm going to need you to bring the boat back to the dock. Rains stood on the stern. The engine idled. She watched him stand there in the dark with the harbor around him and the running lights off, and the city behind him filling with police lights and sirens and the slow, permanent machinery of consequence. She watched him make the last calculation. And she watched the moment, the specific, visible moment, when he ran out of... Rains brought the boat back to the dock. He didn't do it immediately. He stood on the stern for a long moment that stretched past what was comfortable for everyone watching. The 2 federal agents at the dock's edge, Lucien 2 feet behind them, Nadia beside him with her hand pressed against her lip. And she watched the last calculation move through him with the specific visibility of a man running out of options in real time. The engine idled. The harbor current pushed the hull slowly sideways. And then his hand dropped from the cockpit frame and his shoulders did something she had no precise word for. Not collapse, not surrender, something quieter and more final than either, the way a structure settles when the last load-bearing piece is removed. And he stepped to the helm and brought the boat around. The hull bumped the dock. Agent Torres stepped aboard first. The second agent followed. She heard the procedural language begin. The formal identification, the statement of charges, the rights being read in the flat recitative of something done many times, and she stopped hearing the specific words because the specific words weren't what she needed. She needed to see his face. Rains came off the boat onto the dock with his hands being managed by Torres, and he walked past her at a distance of 4 feet, and he did not look at her. He looked straight ahead with the discipline of a man who had decided that the last thing he was going to give her was the satisfaction of his attention. She watched him go. She felt not satisfaction. Not the clean, conclusive feeling she'd spent the past 3 days working toward. Something more complicated and less comfortable. The specific feeling of a thing being over that had cost too much to be simply over. Lucien was beside her. She didn't look at him yet. She watched Torres and the second agent walk Rains up the dock toward the marina gate and the red-blue lights that were painting everything beyond the fence, and she stood on the floating dock in the cold harbor air, with her lip bleeding again and her knees sending their report up through her legs, and she thought about Cora Des, about 7 people in a container, about the women who hadn't been in any container she could find. She thought about all the versions of this that didn't end with federal agents on a dock. All the versions where she'd made a different choice, put the paper down when Castle told her to, taken Raines's offer that morning, gotten in a car, and driven away from Blackwater Harbor with the $11 she'd found in her bag and never looked back. She thought about who she'd be right now in those versions. She thought maybe safer. She thought definitely smaller. She turned and looked at Lucian. He was watching the dock gate where Raines had disappeared. His profile in the harbor light was the same profile she'd spent 3 years not letting herself think about too directly. The jaw, the scar, the particular set of him that said this man has been standing in hard weather for so long, he has stopped noticing it. The federal agents, she said. You arranged them. He turned. Reyes made contact yesterday afternoon, after you found the email chain. He reached someone I trust in the Federal Organized Crime Division. A pause. I didn't know if it would move fast enough. But you moved the operation forward anyway, into the Opera House. We needed Raines in the open, and we needed to give him the opportunity to act, so the agents had something to witness directly. He looked at her face, the lip, the cheekbone. I didn't anticipate Swick moving the timeline up. The lights, the shooter. That wasn't the plan I expected him to execute. But you expected something. I expected something. He held her gaze. I'm sorry I didn't tell you what I'd arranged. She looked at the water. Would it have changed what you did tonight? He said. She thought about standing on the dock with the email chain and looking at Raines and saying everything she'd said. She thought about whether any of it would have landed differently if she'd known there were federal agents in position behind her. No, she said. Then that's the answer to why I didn't tell you. She looked at him. Not because I thought you'd turn back, he said, because I needed what you did to be real, unmanaged. Something moved in his face. It needed to be you, not you performing something I'd scripted. She understood that. She didn't like it entirely, and she understood it completely. You could have told me after, she said. I'm telling you now. She looked at the harbor, the dark water, the lights of the far shore, the cranes standing against the sky like punctuation. The sirens had diminished. The police presence at the Opera House was settling into its procedural phase, the acute emergency giving way to the long work of documentation and processing. Her lip had mostly stopped. She moved her tongue against the closure and found it had held this time. What happens now? She said. Tonight the agents process Raines. Swick is already in custody. Torres had a second team at the Opera House. The financial records, the documents from the container operation, the testimony of the 7 people Reyes got out of Yard 7, that becomes the federal case. He paused. It'll take time. Cases like this take time. And Raines's network, the people in that room tonight, some of them will cooperate. Some will fight. All of them are going to spend the next year very carefully reevaluating their decisions. He looked at the gate. The harbor operation is finished. The routes are exposed. The logistics firm is going to be forensically examined from its first filing to its last. Cora Des is currently in a private medical facility with her family. He said it simply, without weight, as though the simplicity of the fact was the point. I was told an hour ago she's stable. The others are in similar condition. She let that settle. She'd been carrying the specific dread of the answer to that question since the moment she'd seen the still from the surveillance footage, the woman in the car, the container, the 6 a.m. loading window. And the relief of laying it down was physical, a loosening in her chest she hadn't been aware of maintaining. Okay, she said. Just that. Lucien didn't say anything. They stood on the dock for another minute, not speaking, while the harbor moved around them and the city went through its late-night processes, and it was perhaps the most ordinary moment of the last 72 hours. 2 people standing in the cold, not performing anything for each other, just present in the aftermath of something that had taken a great deal out of both of them. Then Nadia turned and walked back up the dock. The debrief happened in 2 stages. The first was immediate. Torres and a second agent she hadn't been introduced to at the marina conducted in a room at the federal field office that smelled of carpet cleaner and recycled air and had a clock on the wall whose second hand moved in the slightly off-rhythm way of a clock running on a dying battery. She sat across from them for 3 hours and told them everything in sequence, starting with the freezer at the Harborline Grill and ending on the dock. She answered their questions with the specific, detailed accuracy that came from having spent 3 days paying close attention because her survival had depended on it, and she signed the statement they produced without reading it carefully because she'd been awake for 36 hours, and because she'd told them the truth, and the statement reflected the truth, and she was tired in a way that went below the body. Torres, who was professionally kind in the manner of someone who had learned kindness as a functional tool and somewhere along the way had let it become genuine, brought her coffee that was worse than anything she'd served in 3 years of waitressing, and she drank all of it. At the end of the 3rd hour, he told her she was free to go. She asked about Lucien. Torres's expression shifted fractionally. Mr. Vero has been cooperating with a separate interview process. The nature of his relationship with our investigation is, he paused, complicated. Is he under arrest? No. Then it's fine, she said. She stood up. The second stage happened 2 days later, in a different building, with a different set of people who were more formal and had better coffee and asked different questions. Less about the operational sequence of what had happened and more about what she knew about Lucien Vero's organization, its structure, its activities, its relationship to various elements of Blackwater Harbor's criminal infrastructure. She answered those questions honestly too, which meant she told them what she had direct knowledge of and declined to speculate about what she didn't. At the end of that debrief, a woman in a gray suit, she'd been introduced but Nadia had lost the name in the fatigue, looked at her across the conference table and said, "You understand that your testimony may be required at multiple subsequent proceedings." "Yes," Nadia said. "And you're willing to provide it?" "Yes." The woman wrote something. "Do you have a place to stay? We can arrange—" "I have somewhere," Nadia said. She didn't, at that moment, but she would. The Harborline Grill was closed. She walked past it on the 4th day, in the mid-morning when the harbor district was at its least populated, and she stood on the sidewalk and looked at the building. The police tape was still across the front entrance from the night of the initial sweep. The neon beer signs were off. The greasy windows held nothing inside them except the dark shapes of the furniture she'd arranged and cleaned and wiped down for 8 months. She stood there for a while. She thought about Marlowe Griggs, who was currently in federal custody pending his own proceedings, who had made his own set of calculations at the yard and in the warehouse, and had chosen wrong consistently enough that there were no calculations left to make. She thought about what he'd been, the loan shark behind the businessman face, the violence behind the business logic, and she thought about what she'd been to him, which was a body that had been in the wrong room at the wrong moment and had declined to be erased. She thought about all the women who had been in the wrong room and had not declined fast enough. She turned away from the Harborline Grill and walked along the harbor promenade toward the water. The harbor looked different in the daylight, post-storm. The cranes were working, life proceeding in its logistical way, cargo moving in and out of the legal, documented portion of the operation, while the rest of it was frozen in federal evidence processing. The docks had a changed quality she couldn't fully articulate, the way a place changes when something that was hidden in it has been removed. Not clean, not transformed, just different in a way she couldn't unsee. She sat on a bench at the promenade's edge and looked at the water for a long time. Her phone buzzed. She'd gotten a new one, pay as you go, bought with money she'd borrowed from a woman named Elaine, who ran the laundromat 2 blocks from the apartment she was temporarily occupying through the generosity of Elaine's cousin. She was going to pay Elaine back. She had, for the first time in several months, a reasonable expectation of being able to do that, because Torres had informed her during the first debrief that a victim assistance fund applicable to her circumstances existed and that she was entitled to access it. She looked at the name on the phone screen. Lucien. She answered. "Where are you?" he said. "The harbor promenade, near Pier 9. A brief pause. "I'll come to you." "You don't need to—" "I know," he said. "I'll come." He arrived in 12 minutes, which meant he hadn't been far, which meant he'd had some sense of where she might go today and had been near it. She didn't know whether that was surveillance or something simpler and more human, and she didn't ask. He sat beside her on the bench. He was in civilian clothes, not the operational dress of the past 4 days, not the suit from the opera house. Just dark trousers and a coat and the look of a man who had also spent several of the past 96 hours in rooms answering questions. He was clean-shaven, but there were shadows under his eyes that Rest hadn't fully addressed yet. They sat and looked at the water. "How did the federal process go?" she said. "As expected." He looked at the cranes. "My cooperation in the Rains investigation provides a certain degree of operational consideration. The details are being managed by attorneys." A pause. "It's not immunity, but it's workable. You knew that going in. The federal agents, you didn't just call them to catch Rains. You called them because it was the play that got you the consideration." He didn't deny it. It was the play that did several things simultaneously. That was one of them. She looked at the side of his face. "Is that okay with you?" he said. Not defensive. A genuine question, asking for a genuine answer. She thought about it honestly. The machinery of Lucien Vero was still the machinery she'd walked away from 3 years ago. Still operated through means she wouldn't choose, still derived from a structure built on violence and leverage, and the patient accumulation of things other people preferred to keep dark. Nothing about this week had changed that. He hadn't become something else in the middle of a crisis. He'd been exactly what he was, which was a man who was very good at identifying what a situation required and providing it. The question was whether what a situation required, in this case, had been worth what it cost. She thought about Cora Des. She thought about 7 people. She thought about the women who weren't in a container because the route had been dismantled. "Ask me something harder," she said. He turned and looked at her. "Ask me whether I'm glad I called you," she said. "That's the question." He held her gaze. "Are you?" he said. She looked at the harbor, the water, the cranes, the city doing its city things behind the industrial roofline, the late October sky pressing down blue and cold and indifferent. "Yes," she said. He looked at the water. "But that doesn't resolve anything," she said. "It doesn't make what you are into something else. It doesn't make the past 3 years into a mistake. It doesn't mean—" "I know what it doesn't mean," he said quietly. "Then what does it mean?" He was quiet for a moment. Not performing thought, actually doing it, taking the time that the question required, which was one of the things about him that had always moved her more than she wanted it to. "It means," he said, "that there is a version of what happens next that is different from the version that happened before, if you want it." He picked something up from the bench between them. She hadn't noticed he'd been holding it, and held it out to her. She looked at it. It was a key. Plain, unremarkable, the kind that went to a deadbolt. "I'm not at the estate," he said. "After the federal process, the estate is complicated. I have an apartment, nothing dramatic. It's a building on the east side of the harbor district." He paused. "It has a kitchen that works." She looked at the key. "This is not the same offer," he said. "As before. I'm not asking you to come back to that. I'm not offering protection or logistics or a version of things that requires you to accept what you left." He set the key on the bench between them and took his hand away. "I'm offering a kitchen that works and someone who isn't going to pretend the past week didn't happen." She looked at the key on the bench. She thought about the woman at the sink in the harbor-line kitchen, making her assessment in the dark window. The $11, the dead car, the split lip, the limited options. She thought about the version of herself who had almost not made the call, who had almost found one more way to manage it alone, who had come so close to choosing the loneliness she knew over the danger she didn't. She thought about what she knew now that she hadn't known then. Not about Rains, not about the container, about herself. About what she was willing to do when it came to it, what she was capable of, what she was not. She thought, "You ran toward a harbor full of people trying to kill you in a dress that wasn't yours, with $11 and a piece of paper against your skin." She thought, "What exactly are you still afraid of?" She picked up the key. She turned it over in her fingers. The weight of it, the small, specific weight of a brass key. The entirely ordinary object that stood in for something that wasn't ordinary at all. "I'm not moving in," she said. "I know. I'm not going back to what this was before. I know. If this is something, it's something I haven't decided the shape of yet." "I know," he said. "Neither have I." She looked at him then, really looked at him, the way she'd been managing not to do with full attention since the kitchen at his estate on that first morning, because looking at Lucien Vero with full attention had always been the thing that complicated her ability to maintain her position. She looked at the exhaustion in him, and the scar on his cheekbone, and the dark eyes that held things she could see more of now than she'd been able to 3 years ago. Not because he was showing more, but because she had become, in the intervening time, and especially in the past 4 days, someone who knew better how to look. He was not a safe person. He was not going to become one. He was also, she knew with the specific certainty of someone who had just watched him run back toward a burning situation he could have walked away from, not the person she'd been afraid he was. He was something more complicated and more honest than that. A man who knew precisely what he was, who had never pretended otherwise, and who had spent 3 days making sure she survived a situation that he could have resolved by simpler means if she hadn't mattered to him. "The kitchen better work," she said. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile exactly, the closest he came. "It works," he said. She closed her hand around the key. They sat on the bench for a while longer looking at the harbor. The cranes moved their cargo. The water did what water does. The city went about its business on all sides of them, indifferent and continuous, the way cities always are when the private dramas of the people inside them reach their various kinds of conclusion. She thought about the apartment on the east side of the harbor district. She thought about a kitchen that worked. She thought about waking up somewhere that wasn't the Harborline Grill's closing shift, and the dead car, and the $11. She thought about what it cost to need help and ask for it. She thought about what it cost to ask for a thing and mean it, and then follow through on meaning it, all the way to the end. She had spent 3 years confusing freedom with the particular loneliness of someone who needed nothing from anyone. She understood now that those were different things, that needing nothing was not the same as wanting nothing, and wanting nothing was not the same as being whole. She'd built a life out of minimal requirements because minimal requirements were difficult to take from her, and she'd called that self-sufficiency, and she'd been partly right about that, and entirely wrong about the rest. The harbor light had changed while they sat, the morning burning into something clearer and colder, the low autumn sun at the angle that made the water look like hammered metal. She turned the key over once more in her hand, feeling its edges, its weight. She stood up. Lucian looked up at her. "Where is it?" she said. "East Harbor, Callaway Street, 4th floor. He paused. "The building has an elevator that works most of the time." Most of the time. 75%. She looked at him. "I'll walk up," she said. She started along the promenade in the direction of the East Harbor district, and after a moment she heard him stand and fall into step beside her. Not close enough to claim, not far enough to disclaim. And they walked along the harbor's edge while the city went about the ordinary business of its morning around them. The promenade was busy now, workers on their way to shifts, a woman with a stroller navigating the uneven boards. 2 men arguing over a delivery manifest outside a warehouse door. The regular, unremarkable texture of a city's working life. Nadia walked through it with the key in her coat pocket and the fading bruise on her cheekbone and a split lip that was 3 days into healing, and she looked at the harbor and the cranes and the buildings beyond them and felt, with a directness that surprised her, that she was somewhere real. Not safe. Real. The difference mattered. At the far end of this promenade, she stopped and turned back to look at the full spread of the harbor. Pier 9 and the boarded Harborline Grill visible from here, small in the distance, the container yard beyond it where Yard 7 sat empty now, the cranes and the warehouses, and the long flat water and the October sky. She'd heard part of a conversation through a door. That was all she'd done. She thought about all the people who hear things through doors every day and walk away from them because the cost of not walking away is visible and enormous, and the cost of walking away is invisible and long. She thought about how many times she had done exactly that in her life and had called it prudence and called it survival. She thought about what it was actually called. She looked at the harbor for a long moment. Then she turned her back on it and walked toward Callaway Street, and Lucian walked beside her, and the harbor behind them held its secrets the way it always had. But fewer of them now, fewer by 7 people in 1 container and 1 politician's very long fall, and that was not nothing. That was in the specific calculus of cities and crimes and the long work of consequence, something close to enough. She put her hand in her coat pocket and felt the key, and she walked. 6 weeks later, Cora Dess testified before a federal grand jury. She spoke for 4 hours without stopping, and when she was finished, the room was quiet for a long time before anyone moved. Councilman Everett Raines was indicted on 16 counts. His attorney released a statement calling the charges politically motivated. The statement was covered briefly and then largely ignored because the evidence was, as Lucien had predicted, of the kind that made such statements difficult to sustain. Leonard Swick cooperated fully. His portfolio, as he'd promised, contained 5 years of documentation. He received a reduced sentence in exchange and moved out of Blackwater Harbor before his hearing date. Marlowe Griggs pleaded guilty to a single charge and gave the federal investigation everything they wanted about the logistics chain in exchange for a resolution that kept him out of a facility he'd correctly assessed would be dangerous for him. He moved to a different city after sentencing, and nobody in Blackwater Harbor spent time thinking about him. Terrence Priel was found in another state 11 days after the harbor operation. He did not cooperate. His case moved slowly through the system, the way cases do when a man has nothing left to offer and no compelling reason to tell the truth. Castle was never charged, not because the federal investigators didn't know what he'd done, but because what he'd done had, in the accounting, also involved 8 years of quietly limiting the damage of what he'd been covering for, and the documentation on the flash drive was worth more to the case than a conviction would have been. Torres told Nadia this in a follow-up call, and she sat with it for a long time after. She thought about Castle at the window with his rearranged face and his 8 years and the flash drive placed on the table without conditions. She thought about the specific economy of that, what it cost and what it was worth, and whether those things could balance. She thought they couldn't. She thought that was true of most things that mattered, and that the imbalance was not a reason to stop trying. She didn't know where Castle went. Lucien, when she asked, said he didn't know either, and said it with a quality of voice that she chose not to examine too closely. The Harbor Line Grill was purchased by a woman who had worked the docks for 20 years and wanted to open a breakfast place, and she took down the neon beer signs and put in new windows, and the fluorescent light above the prep station was, Nadia heard third hand, the first thing she replaced. Nadia got her car fixed. She paid Elaine back with interest, which Elaine refused and then accepted after the third attempt. She found work, not at a restaurant, not yet, something temporary and administrative that gave her structured days while the federal proceedings made their demands on her time. She testified twice. She answered questions each time with the same direct, specific accuracy she'd developed in the first debrief. And each time she drove back from the federal building, she stopped at the promenade and looked at the harbor for a few minutes before going home. Home was the apartment on Calloway Street. She had not, technically, moved in. She had, technically, spent more nights there than anywhere else in the past 6 weeks, and her things had migrated there in stages without formal announcement. And the kitchen did work, and Lucien made coffee in the mornings with the same precise, unhurried economy he brought to most things. And they had learned, in the slow way of two people who had hurt each other through absence and were trying something different from what they'd tried before, how to be in a room together without performing anything for each other. It was not simple. It was not clean. It was honest in a way that simple and clean things rarely were. Some mornings she woke before him and went to the kitchen and stood at the window that looked east over the Harbor District roof lines. And she drank coffee that was better than anything she'd served in 3 years of waitressing. And she thought about the geometry of the life she was inside. It was not the life she'd had before she left. It was not the life she'd built in the 3 years after. It was something third, something that didn't have a name yet, that was still in the process of finding its shape, that was made of choices rather than circumstances for the first time in a long time. She thought about the woman at the Harbor Line sink who had picked up a phone and made a call she'd sworn she would never make. She thought about everything that woman had been afraid of. She thought, most of it happened. Most of the things you were afraid of actually happened. And then she thought, you're still here. The harbor light came up over the roof lines in the east the way it came up every morning. Indifferent, continuous, the light that had been falling on this harbor since before the piers were built. Before the cranes, before the men who ran the city's dark machinery had understood what it was worth to them. It fell on the water and the docks and the apartment buildings and the breakfast place where the Harbor Line Grill used to be. And it fell through the east window of the kitchen on Calloway Street where Nadia Vale stood with a coffee cup and the key that was no longer necessary, but that she kept in her coat pocket anyway. Not as a reminder, just as a thing that was hers. She heard him in the corridor behind her. The particular footstep, unhurried, the sound of a man who had learned that arriving somewhere didn't always require announcing it, and she didn't turn around. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. She looked at the harbor through the window. "Coffee's ready," she said. She heard him move into the kitchen. The morning continued in its ordinary way. The light strengthening, the harbor going about its work below, the city on all sides of them carrying its history forward into whatever came next. Two scarred people in a kitchen, choosing. That was all it was. That was, it turned out, enough.